and this is your first time to ask Michael Jordan a question. The question you asked him was, welcome to the first edition of Storytime. Very excited that you're here today. My very first guest for this brand new podcast is a close personal friend of mine from Vancouver, Canada. Came over to Korea in the year 2000. He's been a sportscaster for 25 years in total, including time at Sportsnet in Canada, where he had the opportunity to interview the likes of, check out the names on this list, NHL superstar, arguably the best player to ever play the game, Wayne Gretzky, NBA superstars Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe. How was Kobe?
Oh, Kobe was awesome. He was a bit of a young punk back then, but he certainly is. He's a cool guy.
Was he giving good interviews, or was he just like, I don't know who you are?
You know, for a guy that young, because I interviewed him, when he was coming out of high school. So we're talking about a 19, 20-year-old kid. And
wow.
Yeah, very articulate and, ready for it in terms of not being nervous for interviews, even at that young age.
Tennis great, Michael Chang. Michael was always my favorite to watch in that group of stars because it was Andre Agassi, it was Pete Sampras, who were kind of the two main superstars at the time. And Michael Chang was my favorite, but he never won.
He won the French Open as a 16 or 17-year-old kid, and then never won a major after that.
When you watch Michael Chang consistently, that was me. Yeah, I don't know his career stats, but I got the impression that he never won. Anyway, the name, when I look at this list, the name that jumps off the page at me is Michael Jordan.
Yeah,
hey, Jay.
He's pretty famous.
Hey, Jay. Are you ready for story time?
Let's get it on.
Like a true sportscaster.
Yeah, so Michael Jordan, I interviewed him. I believe that was after his, actually, I know it was after his first retirement. So it was after his first three-peat. He went and did baseball, and then he came back and did those, the next three-peat. So when I first interviewed him, it was actually in the second link of that. And I don't know what he was like before that, but I would imagine that he was no less of a star.
What year are we talking here?
I'm going to just take a random guess, but I'm going to say probably 97 or 98. I started in Vancouver in 96, and I didn't interview him in my first year there because, it's not that I hadn't worked up the chain of ranks yet, but, I was a weekend anchor, weekday reporter, like 2-3 days a week. And the way it worked was, well, somebody else that was higher than me in seniority wanted to go and see the Bulls. Then somebody else just happened to be there to do the interview. So there was no need for me to go. But I believe it was 97 or 98 when, as the powers be, turned out that nobody else was going to be there that day. So the boss was like, hey, Jason, we're going to send you to the Bulls game tonight. Are you okay with that?
You're like,
yeah!
Immediately like, yep. But you try to play it cool, right? Like, oh, I guess so.
Yeah, I might have nothing to do tonight.
Yeah, right. So who were they playing that night? Do you remember?
Well, obviously it was the Vancouver Grizzlies. And
yeah, right.
Yeah, because that was our home team. So it's not like I got to interview the Bulls all the time as a Chicago reporter. Obviously jealous of the people working there. But instead, on the other end, I was the reporter of the Vancouver Grizzlies when they were an expansion team, when they were losing 60, 70 games a year. And quite often, most of them were terrible. They were horrible. Yeah. And I'll tell you, as a reporter, it makes your life very difficult as a reporter, because when you go to interview players after games and it's always after a loss, those guys, they don't necessarily want to talk to you, and they certainly don't want to be scrutinized about everything that they did wrong again tonight. What was it this time, sort of thing. So those were very, very difficult times. From 96 to 2000 is when I was in Vancouver covering both the Grizzlies and Canucks, and both teams were losing. Never once did either of those teams make the playoffs when I was a reporter there.
Yeah, but this is a great time to talk to Michael Jordan because he probably put up like 75 points on the Grizzlies. It's always more fun to interview an athlete after they won. I'm going to go ahead and assume that the Bulls beat the Grizzlies that night.
They did that particular night, and yes, indeed, it was a blowout game. Ironically, so as I mentioned, that wasn't the first time the Bulls came into town because I actually wasn't even working in Vancouver when the Grizzlies first expanded. So the Grizzlies first hosted the Bulls, I believe, in '96. And interestingly, for that particular game, I don't have the exact details, but I'll give you the gist of it. The Grizzlies were leading after the third quarter by about 10 or 12 points. And this is their expansion year, the first year that, this isn't supposed to happen against the Bulls of all teams, right? With Jordan, with Pippen. And with that team, the Grizzlies are winning. And the famous story is, I'm not going to name names, but one of the players on the Grizzlies bench in the third quarter, as it was ending, taunted Michael Jordan. He taunted him. And then Jordan came back in the fourth and scored, I believe it was around 18 points. And then they blew away the Grizzlies. And that particular player got a talking to from the rest of the team.
That's what we learned from watching that documentary about the Bulls. What was that called again?
The Last Dance.
The Last Dance. Michael Jordan needed one reason, and it could have been any reason to light a fire under him. And apparently that was enough. So after the game's over, okay, so walk us through this, because I think, me included, I don't know how this goes. So after the game, you're going to have some time with Michael Jordan, but you're in a group of people. Do they put you in a room downstairs adjacent to the locker room, or is it like a press conference kind of setup? How did that go?
So there's typically 3 different kinds of interviews that you might do. You might be fortunate enough to get a one-on-one. I did not with Michael Jordan. You might be in a news conference, like you mentioned, where they'll have a room and a podium or a table with the interviewee sitting there with a mic in front of them, everyone else sitting maybe like 10, 20 people, about anywhere from 5 to 20 feet away from the subject, where you ask that person questions on your own. There'll usually be a media director that's there, that's pointing to a particular person, telling them that it's their turn to ask a question. Or in the third case, it's going to be what we call a scrum. And a scrum is where you've probably seen this a ton of times on TV. There's an interviewee, and there's probably about sometimes 5, 10, 15 microphones shoved in front of their face and cameras from all different angles trying to get the good shot of the interview. And sometimes it's a scrum because it can be messy in there. You'll have like 10 to 15 people all kind of stretching out their arms to get that mic in there. And sometimes you have mics bumping into other mics. Sometimes you have people that, they want to get their mic a little bit closer, and you're jostling for position. It gets hot, smelly, and frustrating in there at times. And with the interview with Michael Jordan, that was the case.
But the interview with Michael Jordan with you, if I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it was a little bit different from other interviews that you have done. Maybe when you did your interview with Shaquille O'Neal or Wayne Gretzky, maybe you go into the locker room and you're able to go and choose the player that you want to speak to. But with Michael, it wasn't like that, or at least in your case, it wasn't like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very different. And it was actually very surprising to me because this was the first time that I'd ever been in this situation. So prior to my interview with Michael Jordan, I've interviewed, Wayne Gretzky, Shaq, Kobe, Charles Barkley, whoever. I mean, I'd interviewed a lot of people by then because it'd been 2 or 3 years that, I was doing Major League sports. And in most situations, after the game is over, you wait for a certain period of time, and then the security people will come out. And when they have been told from the team's media relations that it's okay to allow the media to come in, then at that point, the media comes in and the dressing room's open. Especially the road team's dressing room. It's, it's pretty bare bones, but it's just like your typical locker room. You walk in there and everyone has their cubby hole or their locker spot. And you kind of go and you approach different people. Sometimes if one person had an outstanding game, then you'll have all 10 to 15 people approach that one person, and we have a really, really big scrum. Sometimes if it's not as obvious, you'll have groups of 4 or 5 reporters interviewing 3 or 4 different people at the same time, and then you'll go through a rotation perhaps. But in Michael Jordan's case, what was different is that we were never allowed into the dressing room. So the door was locked, and when we were allowed to go in, supposedly, we never actually went in. They would bring the players out. So Michael would come out, and we ended up interviewing him in the hallway. Same with Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, as well as Phil Jackson. So that was the first time that I never saw the inside of the road team's dressing room, was when the Chicago Bulls were in town.
This is the close in this moment. This is the closest you have ever been to Michael Jordan.
Yes, absolutely.
What's it like to be in the presence of Michael Jordan?
It's very different, honestly, from, for instance, okay, so Shaq is by then already world famous, right? And he's 7'1" and just huge. But the way that Shaq carries himself off is like your buddy. He's cool and he's casual, and he knows, like, whether his role is this or that, his personality comes up because he wants to be a bit of a clown, a joker, a fun guy. And, he wants to have fun in his media conferences. With Michael, I would say similar to Wayne Gretzky. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but he understood what his role was within the league. He understood that he was an ambassador, and every single stadium, every single city that he visited, he knew that 100% he had to do an interview. And not every player is like that. If Shaq only scores, let's say, 18 points and gets 8 rebounds and they win, and Kobe was the star of that particular game, then
nobody wants to talk to Shaq.
They might not want to. It'll be different. But no matter what happened, Michael was the star of the NBA. He was the ambassador. And because of that, 100% everybody was going to talk with him. And you have to remember, back in those days, Michael played every game. LeBron James, I don't want to play every game because I want to save myself as I get older. I don't want to get injured. So, a lot of players these days, they don't play every game. Michael played basically every game that he could. He knew that he had a responsibility, and he was an ambassador to the league. And that's the way he carried himself out. When you spoke with him, there was a certain aura that he had where he understood what you're trying to get out of him, and he'll accommodate you the best he can. But at the same time, he was very was cognizant of his image. Like, he knew that he still wanted to carry himself out as larger than life, and he was, and it always appeared that way.
But he knew very well, especially by that point in his career, that every single word that came out of his mouth would be heavily scrutinized and combed over, where reporters would look for something to make a headline out of. No doubt about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I can't even imagine how he would have been in this day and age of social media. But certainly at that time, like I said, there was just a certain aura about him. His presence was unmistakable, and just the way he spoke, he had a certain intensity and honesty, yet intensity about what he was saying. And when I was saying earlier about the difference between Michael Jordan and Wayne Gretzky, for instance, Wayne Gretzky was in the similar role. He was the ambassador of the NHL. He was an 8-time MVP consecutive. He was already the greatest hockey player of all time, whereas Michael was becoming the greatest basketball player of all time. The difference was Wayne was an ambassador, but he had a little bit more of that, lack of a better way of putting it, a little bit more of that Canadian in him. He had like that small town feel where, yes, he's a star, and yes, he's famous and rich and the greatest of everything that he's doing, but he still had a little bit more of that genuine, I'm from a small town, I'll still do the best I can to accommodate every last question. Whereas Michael knew, okay, that's my 5 or 6 questions in this city. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Have a good night. And he knew when to cut it off.
Like a Hollywood movie star doing a junket for a film, right?
Yeah, whereas Wayne Gretzky was more like Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, right. So when the time came, and this is your first time to ask Michael Jordan a question, the question you asked him was?
To be totally honest, I don't remember the exact question I asked him, but I do remember. I remember the gist of it. I asked him something like, "How much do you think the Grizzlies have improved since the last time you saw them, or something like that?" But I think it might have been his first year back from the break, so there might have been like a little bit of a hiatus or something. But I was basically trying to get like, what do you think of the team now compared to what you remember it as before? And,
sure, because you're a Vancouver reporter. You want to get his angle from your local team, right?
Absolutely. Vancouver as well as Canada, because Sportsnet was representative of the entire nation, but certainly it was regional as well. So first and foremost, I'm thinking about the Grizzlies, our fan base, and I want to get his opinion on what he thought of the team this time. He didn't mention anything about the previous taunting situation.
The thing that ignited his 18 points in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, that was not brought up, but certainly, like I said, he's just a professional, and he's done so many interviews that he knows what you want him to say. And for the most part, as long as it doesn't make him look bad in any way, he'll kind of, go along with what you're trying to get out of him, because he knows reporters, when you ask a question, you typically have a story in mind that you're trying to create before you ask the interview. So for me, I'm trying to think like, the Grizzlies are a different team than Michael faced before. Now we have like Sharif Abdur-Rahim and Mike Bibby. And I was trying to get something to that effect of like, this isn't the same team that he burned before. And, I'm trying to get him to say something that fits that narrative, because I'm going to create the story. And he kind of had an idea of that. And, people like that have done that enough times, they know what you're trying to get, and they'll kind of follow along and say something like that for you.
When you went home and you kind of finished your workday, maybe you poured yourself a whiskey or something. Did you just sit there and think, I just exchanged words? I had a dialogue with maybe the greatest athlete from any major sport of all time.
You don't think that, certainly in the moment, because you're busy doing your job. So your focus is more on the questions you're asking, and really trying to listen to what they say, because every now and then they'll say something that kind of catches your attention, and you might want to have a follow-up question, or, depending on how they answer somebody else's question, for instance. But afterwards, yeah, certainly it was one of those things that I didn't really think it at the time, but to be able to say that I've interviewed Michael Jordan, I mean, it's one of the coolest things to be able to say, to throw on your resume and stuff. And yeah,
well, I mean, you're guest number one on this podcast. I'm guessing MJ might be guest number two. So
obviously, because he's so easy to get for an interview.
He's retired now, right? Track him down on a golf course somewhere. What a great story. Jason Lee, thank you so much about the time you met and interviewed Michael Jordan. That was a treat for me to hear. Thank you, sir.
It was fun to tell.
Come back and tell us another interview story sometime.
Oh, you'd be surprised how many I have. I'd love to do another.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Bye.
Bye.
And that's it for our very first episode of Storytime. Everybody's got a story to tell. I really enjoyed chatting with Jason, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Don't forget, hit subscribe and like, and hit that little notification bell so you'll get the notification for when the next episode pops up. Any questions or comments you have on today's pod, please leave them in the comments section, because interacting with you is something that's going to be very important to me. Like I said, hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you again next time.